Such a truly touching video. Who can relate to the story shared in that video? Yeah, most hands here today. We want to thank Rita and Judy for encouraging us to speak today. While working on this keynote, we tried to recapture our innermost thoughts and true feeling, which are constantly evolving, and would share them with you today. It's been a labor of tears, love, and a very tough subject for us. And we hope you find it both uplifting and beneficial. I remember the years when I was a camper at Tico and came home chanting, "Have you got that ruach?" which means spirit. So how does a caregiver keep their spirit alive through the many transitions occurring over the course of Alzheimer's disease? First, let me tell you a little bit about my dad, Alan Shapiro. Then we'll talk about our thoughts, things we've learned during the many transitions, and efforts to keep our spirits alive. For the first 50 years of his life, my dad was an outstanding athlete in track and field. He won a state championship, became president of the Letterman's Club at the University of Minnesota, was an assistant city attorney for the city of St. Paul. He established Chapco Printing with his brothers, in addition to being a leader in the community, a loving husband, and an involved and caring father to my brother, sister, and me. My dad is now 65, and after struggling with young onset Alzheimer's for the last 15 years, he is currently in the late stages of the disease. It's been an ongoing struggle made up of anger, agitation, fear, anxiety, depression, and delusions. I could go on all day. He has slowly been robbed of his memory, reasoning skills, insight, decision-making ability, self-awareness, personality, and his use of language. All essential elements of what makes us who we are. However, his emotions and soul still remain. Today, he lives in a full-time care home. He is no longer able to speak, feed himself, express when he is in need of support or needs to go to the bathroom. He shows little attention or reaction to anything or anyone, not even our family or his beautiful baby granddaughter, Alexia. And it's unclear how much he understands. But what is clear is his fear to do the most basic of life functions.
The disease and earliest transitions occurred several years before Alan's diagnosis. I didn't notice the memory loss that one would expect. Alan seemed scattered. He misplaced things, but could usually retrace his steps and find them. And he never was one to let the truth interfere with a good story. On subjects he knew well, he could talk for hours. But his kind-hearted personality was changing. He was losing the ability to run the company he'd built with his brothers and trying hardest to cover up, to salvage his dignity. He knew the disease all too well because he watched as his father, Sidney, and Uncle Morris die in the prime of their lives to what was then known as pre-senile dementia. Alan wouldn't admit to anyone, even us, that he was having trouble. At the same time, he was experiencing chest pains, and we thought the doctor's recommendation to scale back on his running routine, something he was meticulous about and did to clear his head, was the reason for his escalating anxiety levels. As he became increasingly more anxious and verbally abusive, he would explode at a moment's notice. If anyone said anything that Alan didn't like or agree with, he would take it out on me. We couldn't understand his irrational behavior. Worst of all, after these attacks, Alan would drive off in a rage, threatening to jump off a bridge. We not only feared for his life, but for anybody else who was on the road. Something as simple as a person sneezing on an airplane would set Alan off, and he would verbally attack me. Our daughter Stacy, who was in high school, witnessed all his aggressive behavior, and in the beginning could calm him down. But as time went on, he wouldn't listen to her, and fearing for my safety, suggested that I leave him. I had trouble understanding his anxiety. It didn't occur to me that it could be Alzheimer's because Alan had had 2 MRIs that were normal, and I was unaware that personality change was a warning sign. I tried to be supportive, but because of the abuse, I was angry and fought back. Truthfully, I don't know why I stayed. This abuse went on for 6 years before his diagnosis. At the same time, Alan's youngest brother, Bobby, Oliver Sholem, was also changing. It took Bobby's Alzheimer's diagnosis for me to realize we were heading down a similar path. This time, when Alan went to the neurologist, I accompanied him and made sure that he had a neuropsych exam. I couldn't believe how low Alan scored and how he was able to cover up for all his deficiencies. He couldn't draw a clock or copy an easy pattern, but would always quantify things with a number to make what he was saying more believable. And he could still converse about Gopher athletics. With the results of the exam in hand, we went down to the Mayo Clinic and got the news we anticipated and feared. Alan, too, had Alzheimer's disease. Now the changes in Alan made more sense. I felt sick to my stomach and couldn't sleep through the night for about a year. My mind was racing with so many thoughts. I knew I would lose Alan, but what about my 3 kids? How could I protect them and prevent this disease from destroying our family? I didn't know how much more I could endure. How could I fight this disease that has no cure, no ways to prevent it, and no ways to slow its progression? I also wondered how long Alan would last because I couldn't wait till it was over. It didn't help that Alan didn't want anyone else to know about his diagnosis because of the stigma surrounding the disease, so we kept the big A secret within our immediate family. I couldn't get the support I needed or ask for help, and my kids lived 1,000 miles away. After a year, it was impossible to hide Alan's progression, and news inevitably came out that he, in fact, too, had young onset Alzheimer's. Now it would be easier for me to seek out support, but Alan's adjustment was much harder. He hated when people treated him differently or ignored him completely. I learned early on that caring for somebody with Alzheimer's cannot be done alone. At the time, there were no support systems for me within the Jewish community. I joined a support group through the Alzheimer's Association that met at a local church and enrolled Alan in the Gathering, a program that serves people in the early to mid stages of memory loss that was held at area churches. Both my support group and the Gathering were instrumental in getting me through these tough years. Best of all, I met 4 other women who all had husbands with the disease, and we became instant friends. We talked honestly and freely about anything and everything, and validated our feelings, both good and bad. I could not have survived without them.
It's impossible to understate the importance of having a strong support network and being part of a support group. Unlike a cancer diagnosis, where people flock to offer help and support, the opposite is usually true with Alzheimer's disease. People stay away entirely because they don't know what to do. So it's imperative to seek and accept outside help from family, friends, and your community, or a companion in order to sustain your well-being and spirit. Just as on a plane, when you're instructed to put on your own oxygen mask first, you must maintain your health and strength to take care of someone with dementia. However, most often the caregiver doesn't realize how their own physical and mental health is being compromised. My siblings and I would remind our mom that we didn't want to lose her as well to our dad's disease. And while that seemed to resonate, it wasn't until her doctor let her know that not only did her family but her friends also worry that created the wake-up call that she actually needed. So let the people in your life know how they can best support you and keep them updated on best ways to interact with you and your loved one. This will create a win-win for everyone involved.
I always hear from caregivers that their loved one would never accept a companion. Alan felt the same way and didn't want to leave my side. I needed some breathing space a couple times a week, but how was I going to engineer this? This took some creative planning. I first met with the companion alone and told him all about Alan's likes and dislikes. Then we met at a coffee shop with Alan, and I told Alan that the companion was a friend of my son's. Sometimes a little therapeutic fibbing is necessary. We met a few more times together before leaving Alan and his companion alone. It didn't take long for Alan to enjoy their time together.
While your loved one is still in the early stages of the disease, if not before, sit down together and plan ahead. Having your loved one express his or her wishes and desires for future care could help you down the road when difficult decisions need to be made. Try not to make any promises about keeping your loved one at home, because there could be some point in time in the future when your loved one will be best suited for care outside of the home. During this stage, early on, take advantage of the time you share together, because if you wait to do something you've always wanted to do, it might end up being too late. For example, I realized I never got the chance to ask my dad for advice on life, and looking back, having had that conversation would be extremely valuable for me. Another example is my family got together and recorded my dad sharing a bunch of his old stories and biggest accolades. We wanted to preserve these memories to show our future kids and grandkids how amazing their grandpa Alan was. But unfortunately, we shot the video about 4 or 5 years too late, and my dad was already forgetful, and we had to fill in the blanks of his stories, which was just not the same if he were able to share the stories passionately himself. All in all, if there's something important to take advantage of that you've always wanted to do it now, because if you wait, it might end up being too late and something that you'll never be able to do.
Before the diagnosis, I would fight back with Alan, and once he was diagnosed, I knew that the disease was speaking and learned more effective ways to communicate, to calm situations instead of fueling the fire. When Alzheimer's is involved, actual facts don't matter, connection does. So I would meet Alan where he was at and didn't correct what he believed to be true. Patience, energy, and compassion are needed in endless supply as you care for your loved one. Alan made a scrapbook of newspaper articles from his running days in high school and college. He would look through the scrapbook often. During the mid-stages of the disease, Alan came to me distraught that some of the pages were missing. I knew that this wasn't true. The scrapbook was made of heavy cardboard, and all the pages were intact. Instead of trying to correct him, I validated his concerns and told them that I would check the book. He was satisfied with this response for a short time, but it continued to consume him. To make a long story short, after weeks of obsessing about the book, I told them that I'd put it into the safe deposit box for safekeeping. I told our kids that what I was doing, and they were on board when they called to talk with their dad. Luckily, he finally stopped worrying about it. It's crazy how the brain works. He couldn't remember something I'd said 1 minute before, but he could remember his worries about the scrapbook because of his emotional attachment. I later realized the meaning of this entire exchange. Alan was struggling because he knew he was losing his memories of his running days and was trying his hardest to hold on to them. I found this to be true in many different instances where his thoughts were convoluted, mixed with pieces of reality, and all real to him. In most cases, beliefs or behavioral expressions have an explanation or underlying meaning.
Always focus on what your loved one can do instead of what they can't. Enjoy each day with a renewed hope and hope for spirit for finding the pleasure in the little things and creating moments of joy. I used to go home and visit my parents in Minnesota, and it was very taxing. I'd get there, and I'd feel this huge emotional and energetic drain because I'd go see my dad and see all that had slipped away since the last time I had been home. Whether it was harder and harder to get him to smile or engage with me, or if I had to take him to the bathroom and sometimes work with him for 30 minutes just to sit on the toilet, let alone the post cleanup, it was agonizing for me. And what only made matters worse is how happy I realized I'd become when I'd be heading back to the airport ready to go home. And this made me feel really guilty, given everything that my dad and my mom as his caregiver were going through 100% of the time. And I actually felt this sentiment for a number of years until I changed my mindset entirely. Instead of looking at everything about my dad that was slipping away, I instead started cherishing what was still there. And that made a huge difference for me. Now when I come home, I appreciate my dad's smell, feel his strength when I hold his hand, he's still got a really strong grasp, and aim to be peaceful and just simply send him love and joy. And I enjoy every second that I have with my dad. I'm so grateful that he's still here today, 15 years after having the disease, and that I got to celebrate his 65th birthday with him just this last summer. And I hope that he has another 10 years so I can share them with him as well. All in all, I invite you to try to do the same thing, realizing that it's easier said than done. And there will always be tough moments, so it's important not to be too hard on oneself.
Along the course of the disease, I've tried to plan ahead and anticipate what transition would come next. Even though I can be mentally prepared for change and realize that the change is coming, I'm never emotionally prepared when it happens. After a crisis occurs, I cry, mourn each loss, and then roll up my sleeves to figure out what changes I need to make for the next new normal. But for us, normal means living with uncertainty and adapting. Remaining flexible is key. No matter how much you're in denial and don't want to acknowledge changes occurring, it doesn't work, and it's a recipe for disaster. Safety for your loved one, and in the case of driving, the safety of others must come first. Taking Alan's license was not a hurdle for us because Alan had driven his father when he was sick. However, looking back, I should have taken his driving privileges away earlier. At the time, he was able to drive, but couldn't figure out how to turn on and off the defrost, close the sunroof if he accidentally opened it, and got completely lost on a few occasions. Thank goodness for cell phones, which he still was able to use then. The other important safety concern is when your loved one is no longer safe, staying home alone, and requires 24/7 care. One evening, I went to run an errand. I was only going to be gone for an hour. I told Alan where I was going, and when I'd be back, I also left a note. I came home to find him frantic because he didn't know where I was and no longer knew how to press the button on the phone to reach me. Luckily, he hadn't wandered off to look for me. Before this time, he was scared to go out alone in fear that he would get lost. But now the disease was progressing, and he no longer remembered that fear. I never left him alone again after that incident. I tried to keep Alan involved in our lives as much as possible until we hit roadblocks. Roadblocks is my term for unanticipated events that occurred or physical obstacles that I hadn't foreseen beforehand, such as ending up in the hospital overnight at the beginning of a 2-week trip, or collapsing because of fear when crossing a floor where he envisioned gaping holes. All were extremely stressful as they were unfolding and became what was I thinking moments. When making decisions on whether to include your loved one on a trip, holiday meal, or special family life cycle event, try to determine who you are doing it for, them or you. Will they have success, or will it be too much for them to handle? Will it be too hard for you to navigate? And what penalty you are willing to pay for the reward of being together. Try to keep feelings of guilt to a minimum because you are doing your best and you're doing the best for your loved one. Of all the decisions I've made, the most unsettling and difficult decision was thinking about placing Alan in a care home. I was totally unprepared emotionally, although I knew it was getting too difficult to manage Alan's needs at home. Caregiving was becoming too difficult, even with the assistance of a wonderful and loving aide who worked with me 40 hours a week. At the time, Alan was just getting over pneumonia and had been hospitalized for a few days. He was nonverbal, couldn't feed himself. As Mark mentioned earlier, Alan was afraid to sit on the toilet. By now, I was taking showers with him, and he would invariably get scared, his legs would turn to jelly, and he would collapse on the floor of the shower. I would sit down with him, trying to calm him down before he could eventually turn over and stand up. He was also afraid to get into the car and was beginning to wander. I thought Alan would get better care and felt that he would be safer in a loving care home. I kept telling my kids that I still needed a sign that we were making the right decision. The day of the move, we all sat in the living room at Breck Homes. One of the aides said to Alan, "Let's go get ready for bed." He went with her without turning back to look at any of us. My daughter said, "Mom, that's your sign." It was the best sign I could have gotten. Thankfully, Alan's adjustment went smoothly. I soon realized that Breck was a better place for him because he could live at his own pace. Undeniably, my lifestyle had become too much for Alan. Before the move, Alan's decline was on a fast track, and once he moved, it plateaued and has progressed more slowly. Placing Alan was a blessing for me and allowed me to be his loving wife again. I'm still there for Alan and have continued to respect his likes and dislikes. I choose to visit him every day. However, I do travel and know that while I'm gone, he is in safe, caring, and loving hands. When Alan moved, my role as caregiver didn't abruptly end. It just changed. Alan has now been at the home for over 4 years and is receiving wonderful care. It's easy now to become complacent with where he is at in the disease, and I've stopped looking ahead because I just can't go there. Transitions are more difficult for me to accept and have caught me more off guard. I find that I do better once I've adjusted to the change, not that Alan gets better. It's becoming more and more difficult for me to watch his decline and dealing with the ambiguous loss of the reality that he is both here and gone. As a caregiver, I still go through waves of being okay and not as okay, and I never know when these waves will hit or for how long. I think one of the hardest aspects of Alzheimer's is facing just how long, exhausting, lonely, tiring the journey is. However, unlike in the beginning, I'm not ready for the end, and I live for the moments when Alan makes a connection and gives me a warm and loving smile. My friend David lost his wife Linda of Alzheimer's a year and a half ago. He expressed his thoughts when Linda was at the end stage of her disease. He wrote, "The experiences of this week bring home the most difficult aspects of the disease, the terrible decisions that need to be made about treating or not treating illness, when the simplest cold or flu could end her life, and the two contradictory emotions that coexist at all times in our hearts, the desire for her to keep on fighting and wish that the fight would be over. And when your mind has brought your feelings around to accepting the inevitable, she will have good days and awaken the hopeful feelings again. The internal struggle is our constant companion, and it is exhausting." A month later, my friend Nancy lost her husband Lenny, also to Alzheimer's. I was thrown for a loop. During the previous 7 years, I was so worried about my kids' chances of getting Alzheimer's that I hadn't thought at all about how the disease robbed Alan and me of the once beautiful relationship we shared. Celebrating family Simcas, sharing the joys of the birth of a grandchild, and growing old together.
In closing, we've spoken about many approaches today. to help you in your role as a caregiver, getting support, effective communication, living in the moment, focusing on what your loved one can do, being flexible, safety first, planning ahead to avoid crisis, keeping guilt to a minimum, and placement of your loved one. These are all ways to help you successfully navigate through this long and difficult disease. But what about you and how to keep your spirit alive? So now I ask you again, have you got that ruach? Living in California and knowing my dad was in good hands with my mom, I chose to kind of neglect and avoid and ignore Alzheimer's and the future of the disease, isolating myself away from it entirely, and that was taking a toll on me even though I didn't realize it. When I started taking responsibility, raising awareness for the disease, making videos and running campaigns, I found it to be very empowering. Alzheimer's is a disease, it's not a normal stage of aging. So we encourage you to speak openly about it and share your stories, as our collective and unified efforts and voices will make a huge difference and help to ensure that those of us in our 20s and our 30s have memories of our children and our grandchildren.
I can't say that Alzheimer's hasn't taken its toll on me, both emotionally and physically, or feeling that my soul is diminished. I haven't begun to even mention how much I miss Alan. However, I am fortunate to have a wonderful support network of family and friends. I'm lucky that both my parents are with me here today. My kids are a great source of strength, and I feel blessed that we are all on the same page in the decisions we've made. I've met some incredible caregivers who have traveled the journey with me, and I always look forward to the time we spend together laughing and crying. Thank goodness for my constant companion, Boker Tove, who gives me emotional support and lots of kisses. He is my 6-pound poodle Bashan pup who has reminded me for the past 5 years to start each day with a good morning. And my most cherished time is spent visiting my 2.5-year-old granddaughter, Alexia. I find hope and strength in my volunteer work with the Alzheimer's Association by advocating for change for Alzheimer's patients and their families so they can get the support they need, raising awareness by telling our story, and participating in research to find a treatment or cure. Everybody has a trial match card in their folders. Please fill them out. We need help to find a cure. I've also enjoyed working with our Jewish community to make it more dementia-friendly. Lastly, I've learned so much more about myself, stepped out of my comfort zone, and feel that I'm a better person. Alzheimer's chaplain Ron Hilmer writes, "Finding the good in a bad situation takes more than just outward strength. It takes the wholeness that comes when body, mind, and spirit work together."
While a tough reality for our family and millions of others, we are optimistic for the future because together we can and will end Alzheimer's.